just to hammer this point home, the reason why you have to respect the law, if you fully understand it, is because it really does embody, for Kant, the very concept or idea of rational action. Or in other words, this idea that human beings act for reasons, whereas other things don't. So Kant's very impressed by this idea. Every object in the world obeys rules, but only human beings get to pick which rules they obey. So now, as a human being, of course, I don't get to pick to obey the rule of gravity, the law of gravity, but I do get to choose whether to drive the speed limit or to tell the truth or to follow any of the other rules which are laws which exist out there, show up on class on time, etc. Other objects in the universe just obey laws. They don't get to choose which laws to obey. So in the recognition that we ought to obey the moral law, we are expressing the very concept of freedom of the will, of real free autonomous action, by recognizing, the moral law is that which ought to guide my behavior. An animal can't do that, to Kant thinks. Dogs never get to see what's so fantastic about universal moral laws. Neither, of course, do they get to see what's so fantastic about the law of gravitation. Neither do they get to see what's so fantastic about the laws of logic or arithmetic or mathematics or calculus. They just can't see that, and it's reason which allows us to see it. And so it's reason which is going to not only allow us to see why the truths of mathematics are the way that they are, but also why the moral realm is the way that it is. So again, what's being developed here is this, as we go through this, I don't want you to lose sight of this very long, complex argument that the foundation of morality is reason in the real sense that you find it in logic, namely detection of contradiction. Okay, so let's examine this idea closer. So first we got to say what's a maxim is. We've got to say what it means that you could will it to be a universal law. And then we're going to provide some examples of how this is done. So a maxim for Kant is simply something like a description of what the person is doing in such a way that the person would approve of it. So, for instance, if you are asked a question about whether someone looks fat in a pair of jeans or not, and you say what is false and what you know to be false, that they don't look fat in those jeans, then we can say that the maxim you endorse is that when asked awkward questions, it is appropriate to lie in order to save a person's feelings or to avoid a confrontation. So there's a little policy that you have. I mean, you may not be explicitly thinking about it, but if someone were to put that question to you, oh, so you think it's okay to lie to save someone's feelings or to avoid a fight, you would say yes. So a maxim is just the thing that the person would assent to as a description or general description of what it is that they're doing. Now, that's not overly precise, but that's about as good as we get out of Kant's writing. Now, the categorical imperative works on maxims, so you need to have this kind of description. And generally what you're doing is you're sort of taking this general personal rule that this person has. They're saying, look, I think this is okay. In these kinds of situations, it's okay to tell a lie. Then what you're doing then is asking what the world would be like if everybody followed the rule that you have in mind. That's what it means to universalize the maxim. So what would the world be like if everyone thought that it was okay to lie in these kinds of circumstances? Would there be some kind of problem? Now, in particular, when we're thinking about these possible worlds, where your maxims are universal laws of nature like the law of gravity, people don't have a choice now. You're sort of just imagining. Everybody lies all the time to avoid any kind of conflicts. They lie for any reason that they think is appropriate, because really that's what this maxim amounts to in the universalized case. You're saying, well, look, in this case, I think it's appropriate to avoid conflict, so to do something that I think it's morally permissible, to promote some good which I think is important, I can say something which is a lie. So in a world where everybody acted that way, what would happen? Well, of course, everyone would be lying. But Kant's not interested, strictly speaking, in the consequences of the action. Rather, what he's interested in is whether or not there's a contradiction in the world that we're imagining. If we detect some kind of contradiction in the first instance, then we know automatically, right off the bat, this action that we're describing with the maxim is immoral. So before we get into the case about lying here, think about this in terms of physics. Suppose a person were to tell you that it was a law of our world that an object could be in two places at once. Well, you might say, what would the world be like if that were a law of physics, that any object could be in two places at once? Would there be a contradiction in that world? Well, yeah, the world would be full of contradictions because, for instance, it would be the case that you're wherever you are right now, but also somewhere else at the same time. Now, that's just Kant thinks it couldn't be true. So there can't be a law of physics which says that two objects, there can't be a law of physics which says that one object can be in two locations at the same time. You can just rule that out by noticing that there would be a contradiction in that world. So too, when one thinks about a world where people lie in order to promote something that they think is good, there's also a contradiction. Namely, that a person wouldn't even be able to lie in such a world. Lying crucially depends on other people accepting what you say as true. But of course, in a world where everyone was lying for whatever reason, nobody would ever accept anything that anyone said as true. So the very thing that you're thinking about doing, lying in order to avoid a conflict, the very thing that you're thinking about doing would be impossible in a world where everyone followed the rule that you're following. So imagining that everyone acted this way shows you, Kant thinks, that the thing that you're doing is contradictory and therefore irrational. Now, as a rational creature, you can't endorse that the world be contradictory in nature. And so here you are suggesting that there be this universal moral rule, that it's morally okay to act in this way. But that results in something that's contradictory. So you can't endorse it. You can't tell a lie, even when you think it's going to be for the best. You can't make that the case. Now, this is something that Kant talks about in a lot of different places. He says, look, if you ever think about it carefully when you're about to do something that you to violate one of your duties. So you're about to tell a lie, you're about to steal some printer paper from work or something like that. You sort of think to yourself, if you were to be honest with yourself, Kant thinks, you think to yourself, well, gee, I recognize that I don't think that everyone should act this way. But in this particular case, it's okay. So you try to make an exception of yourself to this universal moral rule. So no person who steals thinks that, stealing is good, everyone should steal. Rather, usually what they think is that in this case, the circumstances merit that I should steal, right? And that's sort of what the no rule absolutist, someone like Aristotle, that's what they're going to say, that, if the virtuous person decides or comes to the conclusion, in this case, stealing is something that should be done, then that's okay. If the virtuous person comes to the conclusion that in this case lying is good, then that's the good action. It's the one that the virtuous person performs. But Kant is here saying, no, 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 that can't be right. That in some cases lying is good, and in other cases lying is bad. Because the moral commands don't admit of these kinds of exceptions. And you're basically saying then, well, these things that are universal in nature can have exceptions, and that's irrational fundamentally in its nature, Kant thinks, to say that moral laws have exceptions. None of them have exceptions. Now, there's a complication here that we need to bring up at this point. So there really are two different ways of getting a contradiction. And so, correspondingly, two different kinds of duties. So there's the first kind, which Kant calls perfect duties. And perfect duties are the ones that result from a contradiction straightforwardly, like the one we've just been talking about. And we'll give examples of these, so don't worry. But then there are also what he calls imperfect duties, because there are some things that you can imagine coherently without contradiction. But when you think about it, you can't really want the world to be that way. So just to take a non-technical example, the book talks about gas-guzzling SUVs. So think if everyone drove a car which got 5 miles to the gallon, what would the world be like? Well, it'd be smoggy, chaos, fog pit. Now, it doesn't seem like there's any contradiction there, technically speaking. But could you really want the world to be that way? Is that a world that you could really want to live in? Well, Kant thinks, no, we can't really want that world to be, our world to be that way. But there's no technical contradiction. It contradicts some kind of inclination at a basic human level. And this gives rise to what Kant calls an imperfect duty. Imperfect duties are sort of, they're still duties, but they're less impressive than the perfect ones because they depend on some unique feature of human nature. And if that feature of human nature were different, our imperfect duties would be different. Whereas the perfect ones depend only on our rational nature, and so are better. Even if there were an alien sponge life form, if it had reason, it would be obligated to tell the truth and not lie. But it might not be obligated if it lived on a different world, in a different planet, with different desires and different biology. Gas-guzzling cars wouldn't be an issue for it. So that depends on specifics around here, whereas telling the truth doesn't. It just has to do with the notion of what's logically consistent. And it's not logically consistent to think that you could have a world where everyone was simply lying when they thought it was okay, because then no one would be able to lie. So there's a contradiction there. Okay, so let's illustrate this with an example that Kant talks about. Now, he actually talks about promise keeping, and this is a similar kind of example to the lying one, but dealing with promises. So, and this is good because this is Kant's own example. He doesn't do the lying one that we just talked about, lying when one thinks it's appropriate. He does this promise-breaking one, which involves a lie. So, suppose that you need money. And suppose that what you do then is, say you're short on your rent, right? So you're thinking to yourself, gee, I'm really kind of screwed here because I'm $350 short on my rent. My landlord's going to kick me out. What am I going to do? Well, suppose you know that your friend has the money. Okay? So now you think to yourself, how can I get this person to give me that money? I know, well, I'll ask them to borrow it. And the person says to you, well, sure, I'll loan you the money, but I need you to pay me back by the end of next month because I'm going on a trip and I need this money back. Now, suppose you think to yourself, well, gee, there's no way I'm going to be able to pay him back by the end of next month. But that's okay. I'll just tell him that I will pay him back. So, because I need the money. So the only way I can get him to give me the money is to tell him what he wants to hear. So you say, I promise I promise I'm going to pay you back. Even and you think to yourself, well, I'll explain to him later or something like that. Okay, so you promise to repay him the money even though you know you can't do so. Well, remember, to use the categorical imperative, first thing you got to do is formulate the maxim. So what's the maxim in this case? When I need money, I will borrow it and promise to repay it even though I know I cannot do so. So if someone were to stop you and say, so wait a minute, you think it's okay to promise something even though you don't intend to keep it? You would have to say yes, because that's what you're doing. You think that that's okay. So now the next thing you do then is to universalize that maxim. What if everybody went around making promises that they didn't intend to keep? What would the world be like? Would there be a contradiction? Now, would there be a contradiction in this scenario? Well, Kant thinks, yeah, of course there would. Why? Well, think about it. In this world, it's a law that people promise to do things that they never intend to do. So every promise that's made is one that the person doesn't intend to keep. Is that a world where people can even make promises? No, there can't be any promising in a world where people don't really think you are. I mean, so think about our ordinary world analog of this. If you are bouncing checks all over town, no one will take a check from you because they don't believe that you have the money. Checks only work if they believe you. So too, saying I promise to do something only works if people generally believe that you're going to keep your promise, that promises are kept, that there's something to it. Once people realize that there's nothing to it, words are cheap. It's only if it's honored that promising can continue. So in a world where everyone was acting the way that you're thinking about acting, in other words, in a world where people made promises they never intended to keep as a matter of rule, the very thing you were trying to do would be impossible to do. So in that world, people are promising because we describe it as one where you make a promise. But of course, no one can be promising in that world because everyone realizes that you aren't really promising when you say that. So it's a contradiction there. You have someone who says they're promising, so that's usually how you promise. But they can't be promising because nobody takes them at their word. So in that world, it's impossible to promise. That's a contradiction because what you say you're doing is promising. So breaking your promises, making promises that you don't intend to keep is contradictory. It's irrational to make a promise that you don't intend to keep. It's immoral to make a promise that you don't intend to keep. And more generally, it's immoral to lie, right? So we've seen already so far two basic duties derived from the categorical imperative, from just thinking about what's logically consistent and what isn't logically consistent. Somebody who thinks that it's appropriate to lie is irrational because they endorse basically a universal rule which allows there to be contradictions. And Kant just thinks that at our nature as rational beings, we can't endorse that. Okay. So you have a perfect duty to keep your promises. You have a perfect duty not to lie. Not to do so is irrational. Now notice, of course, that this is very, very, very important. Kant didn't say, well, if everyone went around breaking their promises, society would break down. There would be terrible consequences for us and the environment, etc. That doesn't matter to him. He doesn't care about the consequences. What matters is that when we describe this world, we describe something that entails a contradiction. So we describe a world where people are promising, but where they can't be promising. And so we literally end up with something that is contradictory. It's not that there are bad consequences in this world. That's irrelevant for determining whether there's a perfect duty or not. What matters is whether or not the maxim is contradictory when universalized, because it's a requisite condition on any moral rule that it be universalizable. That's what the categorical imperative tells us. You have to be able to say consistently, everyone should do this. But of course, what Kant thinks is that when you are lying, or when you are stealing, or when you are murdering, you don't think everyone should do this. You think, no, and that's not the case that everyone should do this. I just need to do it right now. Which, of course, is the essential characteristic of acting immorally, he thinks. Now, so I say, notice here, the same reasoning gets you to the conclusion that you ought not to lie. It's the exact same reasoning. We've already been over that. But just to re-emphasize that point, when one lies, one hopes that the person believes what one says. That's the point of lying. You want the other person to think that it's true. But in a world where everyone did that, no one would ever think that it was true, and so no one could lie. So the very act of lying, then, is irrational and self-contradictory at its very nature. Okay, now, that establishes that it's immoral to lie. And so, according to Kant, just like there are no circumstances under which 2 plus 2 is 4, or under which something is both true and not true at the same time, so also there are no circumstances under which it's morally appropriate to lie. Period. End of story. That's, unfortunately, says Kant, just the way that it is. Well, this brings up something which has been discussed a lot in the history of moral philosophy, and that's the murder at the door, so to speak. So even in Kant's own time, common criticism of him was the following scenario. So imagine what I sometimes refer to as the Terminator scenario, right? The Terminator's there. It's a person. They want to kill a certain person. You know where this person is. They're upstairs doing your laundry, baking cookies for you, something like that. And the murderer says, where's this person? I want to shoot him in the face. Well, you know where they are. What are you supposed to do? Well, as we've already discussed, people like Aristotle judge that, well, in these sorts of circumstances, it certainly seems that the right thing to do is to lie, right? When the Nazis are looking for Anne Frank, you ought not to tell the Nazis where she is, even if you know. If they ask you, you should lie to the Nazis and say you don't know where she is. But Kant denies that that's right. He says, look, nope, that's wrong. It's always wrong to lie. There are no circumstances under which it's morally permissible to lie. Now, Kant is aware that people find this counterintuitive. They say, wow, that's so strange. You ought not to lie even to save a person's life? Yeah, that's right, Kant thinks. So, and it goes back to his view about consequences, which we talked about earlier. The consequences of the action aren't in your control. You don't have control over the consequences. They don't matter for determining the moral worth of an action. It's solely whether you're motivated by your moral duties. And one has a moral duty to be honest, not to lie. So even in this circumstance, when dealing with the murder at the door, one has a moral duty to be honest, not to lie. So even in this circumstances, it's wrong to lie. Now, Kant says, suppose that you did lie. Say that you, the person is upstairs as far as you know, and so you lie and say, oh, the person has gone home. They're not here, they're at their house. Now, you think that's a lie, so you're lying to the person. But suppose, unbeknownst to you, the person has snuck out of the upstairs room and fled to their house, and you have sent the murderer straight to them. Well, in that case, then it would have been bad to lie. You should have told the truth and said that the murderer, to the murderer, that the person was upstairs. They would have went up there and they wouldn't have been there. You could have swore, well, they were here, blah, 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 blah. But since you lied, you sent the murderer right to the person's door. So how are you to know what's going to happen when you tell this lie? You should do what's morally right as far as you can tell by a priori reasoning. Lying is always wrong, because if everyone did it, the truth itself would be impossible. It would be devalued, and lying itself would be impossible. It's contradictory. So now, if this person then is bent on committing murder, that's their fault. You shouldn't take responsibility for their sins. You have a moral duty. The moral duties you should prescribe for you, telling the truth. Now, so does this murderer. The moral duty he has not to take an innocent life. And Kant thinks there are no circumstances under which it's morally permissible to murder someone. To take an innocent life is morally wrong under all circumstances. So this person has a duty. They're not following it. So that's their problem. They're going to have to deal with that. You have your duties, and you can't control this person. So, and you can't control the outcome of your actions. So what you should do is do what's right, what's morally commendable, and that's telling the truth. Even if you think the circumstances are unbearable, that's irrelevant. You have a duty to do what's right, and the good person is the one who does what's right. Now, that's, of course, highly counterintuitive. Lots of people disagree, and that's understandable. But nonetheless, Kant's giving an argument here, and this is his position. And so, again, it's not always important that you agree with these people. What's important is that you're able to see what the arguments are and why they think what they do. And then you're able to, when we get to the utilitarians, we'll have some counterexamples and arguments. And so then you'll be able to argue against this. But for now, you need to understand this was Kant. Okay, so let's just do stealing just to hammer this home. Now, Kant doesn't himself do stealing, but I think it's important to do it and see how this expands. So suppose that you need to do something innocuous like printer paper, right? Suppose you're at work, you need printer paper. They have 3 reams of it sitting there, stacks of paper. You think to yourself, I'm going to take one. Well, is that immoral? Yes, Kant thinks. Why? Well, again, categorical imperative shows us. First, you formulate the maxim. Well, what are you doing? So if someone came up to you and said, hey, what are you doing? You say, well, I'm taking this paper. And they say, what do you mean? Well, they have extra paper, and I need it, so I'm taking it. And then the person would say, okay, so basically then you think it's okay to take something that isn't yours when you need it. Well, you would have to say yes, because that's what you're doing. So we take that rule that you are following right now. When I need something, I take it even if it's not mine. And you universalize it. What if everyone did that? Now remember, we're not here thinking, well, they do it if they want to or certain occasions, but they must do it, right? We're universalizing the maxim, which means we're asking, what would the world be like if everyone had to do this? Well, we can imagine the world where there would be a bunch of people, there would be stuff, and you could get some stuff, but you couldn't really say that the stuff was yours because someone would come and take it from you if they wanted it, if they needed it, and then you would have to try to stop them if you could, but if you couldn't, then it was just theirs. Now, is there a contradiction in this world? Well, Kant thinks that there is a contradiction in this world, and that should be obvious because remember, what he's doing here is trying to show us that the categorical imperative grounds our moral duty. So I haven't said that up until this point, but it's an important point to make. Kant doesn't think that he's trying to prove something which you don't know already. So it's not as though he's trying to prove to you that you should tell the truth or that stealing is wrong or that you should keep your promises. In fact, Kant thinks that the average person already believes all this stuff. The average person already knows that they should tell the truth and keep their promises and help others and so on. But of course, Kant thinks the average person doesn't know why it's morally right to do that. And the average person doesn't know what to say in response to the challenge from the egoist and the relativist who say that either it's not really right to tell the truth, it just depends on how you feel about it or what your culture says, or the egoist who says, well, it's only right to tell the truth because it benefits you somehow. The average person doesn't know how to respond to that, but they feel beset upon, Kant thinks. So the categorical imperative and this whole argument about reason and rationality and contradiction is just supposed to be able to give a response. When somebody says, well, you think you should tell the truth all the time, but why think that? Well, here's an answer that's a little bit more technical, and the average person isn't usually interested in doing it, but it's sort of the equivalent of a person who wanted to know, well, if you say all men are mortal and you say Socrates is a man, why should you believe Socrates is immortal? The average person does, but they often don't have the training in logic which allows them to give an argument for that conclusion. So that's what Kant's doing here. He's just trying to vindicate or justify our everyday ordinary beliefs about morality, which he takes to be of the absolutist variety. Right? He doesn't think the average person is a relativist. He says it over and over again. The average person is an absolutist. They think that these things are absolutely true. The person on the street believes that it's right to tell the truth and to keep your promises and to help others. And what Kant is just trying to do is show that they're right and that the relativist is wrong. And why? Now, I don't know if that's right or not, but that's what Kant thinks he's doing. And so that's kind of interesting. So when he's going through this then, saying, how is stealing contradictory and is it right or wrong to steal? We already know the answers in some sense. Of course the answer is no, it's not right to steal. So what Kant's trying to do is show, well, look, the categorical imperative actually captures why it's wrong to steal. And it allows us to sort of, when we reflect on it, to see that the categorical imperative is the right moral law. It's the one which commands our respect. Okay, so that's a bit of a bracket here, but an important point nonetheless. Back to the story then. Is there a contradiction here? Well, of course, we know Kant thinks there is a contradiction. What is it? Well, we've already said that. In this world, people are just simply taking whatever they need when they need it. So if I need to get to work and I need to drive a car there, I simply take whatever car's around, I steal it. Right? I break into the car, hotwire it, drive off. Someone else needs the car, they take it later. If someone steals that car, I take a different car. So if I need some food, I just grab some. I break into your house, I take the food. I break into this place, I take the food. So whatever is around, and if I need it, I just take it. What's contradictory about that? Well, notice Kant thinks that in this world that we're describing, there would be no such thing as ownership. Now, why not? Because to own something is more than just possessing it. For instance, I own a car. Now, if I loan you my car, I give you the keys and you drive it around, you do not own my car, even though you possess my car. Why not? What do I have that you don't have? Well, what I have is I have a legal right to the car. I have the deed. I have the title. It's registered under my name, not yours. So I have a right to the car. Now, what does it mean to have a right to the car? Well, Kant says to have a right is to be able to make a claim and to have somebody back it up. So if you took my car from me, since I own it, I can complain to the police and we can prosecute you. But in the world we're imagining, there is no ownership. Right? There is no ownership. There's merely possession until somebody else comes and takes it from you. But of course, the problem here is that when you steal something, you try to own it. You try to make it yours. But of course, in the world that we're imagining, there is no ownership. So again, the very thing you're trying to do can't be done. It's contradictory. Now, why think that a person who steals something tries to own it? Well, think about this commonsensically. This happens all the time. For instance, your friend has a really nice sweatshirt that you really like. Your friend lets you borrow it. You wear it out one night, the hoodie, something like that. You really, really love this sweatshirt. Now, suppose that you just lie to your friend and say that it was lost, and you keep it because you love it so much, right? So you say, "I'm gonna steal this sweatshirt." Now, suppose you have this sweatshirt for a while, and then one of your other friends sees it. Oh, isn't that so-and-so sweatshirt? Oh, yeah, I know. I told them it was lost. Ha, ha, ha. Ah, interesting, they say. Can I try it on? Sure, they try it on. And then you say, can I have it back? They say no. You say, what? Give me that. It's my sweatshirt. Now, what's the right response that this person is going to make? Usually, they say things like this. It's not yours. You stole it. Well, what's the joke here? The joke is that it's right. If you just take something, that doesn't make it yours. So in this world we're imagining where everyone's just taking anything they need, that doesn't mean that they own it. But they think that it's theirs. And they often feel neglected or wronged when someone takes something from them. But in this world, no one can own something. So the very act of stealing embodies this contradiction. Namely, that you're trying to gain some right to this thing which you have no right to, or you're trying to own something in a world where nothing can be owned. So, stealing is always wrong under all circumstances, Kant thinks. There are never any circumstances under which stealing is morally acceptable. Even in the counterintuitive kinds of cases that you might think, yes, even in the cases where you're starving to death and you want to steal a piece of bread, Kant says it's always wrong to steal. It's never morally right to steal. So very different than the kind of view that Aristotle had, where he said, look, it depends on what the virtuous person actually decides is right in the circumstances. And so when we're trying to figure out what's morally right and what's morally wrong, we have to think about what virtuous people would do in these situations. What does the good person do? And Kant is here saying, no, that's not what you do. Because you can say, the good person might say, well, in this case, right, you can imagine, would Mother Teresa steal something to feed a starving child? Yeah, probably she would. But Kant's here saying, no, that's immoral. It's irrational because it embodies this contradiction. So a very different kind of view that Kant has. So we've been talking only about perfect duties so far, the ones that entail contradictions, according to Kant, when you try to maximize, when you try to universalize these maxims. So now what we're going to do is start talking about the imperfect duties. And the imperfect duties, remember, are imperfect because we don't get technical contradictions when we imagine these scenarios. So take, for instance, the example of helping others when you have the ability to help them. Now that's important. Kant doesn't think that you just have the duty to help others all the time, but only when you're in the position to help them. So if you happen to have an extra $100 and someone really needs that money, but you would rather spend it on a night out with your wife or something like that, well, Kant thinks that you have a duty to help this person because you're able to help them. So now if you don't have any extra money, you literally can't even afford your own rent, then you don't have a duty to give this person money. Because you can't afford to give this person money. So you only have the duty to help other people when you're able to help them. But why does he think this? Well, suppose you see someone on the subway being mugged. Now, suppose you're able to help them. You could call 911. There's a police officer being distracted at the other end of the car, or you're a large enough person physically trained in the martial sciences that you could step in relatively confidently. Now, of course, you can't guarantee that you won't be hurt, but let's say that, because sometimes fulfilling your duties may entail that you risk your life, even get harmed. So you can't simply say, well, I might get hurt and therefore I'm not going to help this person. So if you're able to help the person, suppose you choose not to. Suppose you're a black belt and you just think, I don't want to get involved, I might get hurt. Or suppose there's a policeman there and you think, I don't want to get involved, I might have to testify, and then in my neighborhood that's bad or something like that. So what do? Well, you formulate the maxim. The general maxim here is, when I'm in a position to help other people, I won't, for whatever reason. Now, what would the world look like if this were a universal moral law? Would there be a contradiction? Well, it would be a cold and calculating world, but there's no contradiction there. We can certainly imagine a world where nobody helps anyone else. Certainly seems possible. It's not a great world. It's not a fantastic world. It's sort of a world full of Scrooge McDucks, but it's something that we can certainly imagine. No contradiction. But could you really want the world to be that way? Now, this is what I was talking about previously, that it's a different kind of contradiction that's at work here. So Kant thinks that the problem here is that we recognize that in that world where nobody helped anyone, that would be a world where nobody helped you. But of course, Kant thinks, being rational as we are, we recognize that we need help. We need other people to help us reach our goals. There will be times when we need to accomplish some goal and where we will be unable to do that on our own, and we will therefore have to depend on the help of others. Now, what do you do with someone who disagrees with that? Says, I'll never need help. Well, Kant just thinks that's irrational. It's demonstrably false that one person isn't able to achieve all of their goals all on their own. They need help at some point. So if that's the case, if it's really the case that if you think about it, you recognize that there's going to be at least one time where you're going to need somebody else's help in order to reach some goal of yours, well then, you can't rationally or consistently will that the world be such that no one helps anyone. Because then you're basically determining that the world should be such that you don't achieve your views, which you can't want. You can't want the world to be such that your goals aren't going to be achieved. You want your goals to be achieved, and that's important. So there's a contradiction in will here. You can't really want the world to be this way, Kant thinks. And so therefore you have an imperfect duty to help others, because you can't, even though you can consistently imagine the world being this way, you can't really want it this way. Okay, so here's another Here's another one of Kant's examples. So the example of suicide, a bit more controversial than some of these other examples. Kant thinks that we have a duty to preserve our lives and that suicide is immoral. And interestingly, he gives an argument from the categorical imperative aimed to show this. Now again, he took this that the common person thought that suicide was immoral. And part of the reason for this is that Kant was a Christian, and it's a traditional part of Christian morality that suicide is immoral. Commonly put in such ways as that it's not up to us to decide when we die, but that's up to God. So suicide is strictly ruled out on a lot of religious views. And Christianity is not the only one. So now we're asked to consider a person who wants to commit suicide because their life is just too unbearable for them to continue living. What does the categorical imperative tell us about this? We know, as we were just discussing, what various religious views tell us about this. Muslims as well as Christians agree suicide is immoral. At least now they do. It hasn't always been the case. In medieval times, suicide was considered a virtue in some instances, and in some cultures, suicide is still an acceptable practice. For instance, in some cultures, if one is dishonored, it's appropriate to take one's own life or something like that. So what does the categorical imperative tell us about this? Well, we take the maxim, which is just that whenever a person is fed up with living, they kill themselves. So it's for self-love that you're doing this, because your life is just too unbearable. So in order to end all this agony, and in order to end the suffering that you have, you're going to end it all. So really, you can say that it's the thing that's doing the work here is that you want to avoid all this suffering, which is that. So the compass that is putting it by self-love. Now, Max universalized that maxim. What if everyone did this whenever life was unbearable? They just killed themselves. So now again, remember, he's not interested in the consequences of this. So he's not going to, for instance, argue, oh, well, then the human species would die off, bad consequences. That's not what he's concerned with here. So it's something different, the contradiction business. Is there a contradiction here? Well, Kant thinks, yeah, there is a contradiction here. Namely, in the reason that you act for self-love. So self-love here, then, is the reason that we normally use to justify preserving our life. So think about this for an instance. Why do we want to avoid pain? What is the purpose of pain? Now, clearly pain is not fun. We don't like pain. But does pain serve a purpose? Well, clearly pain does seem to serve a purpose. It alerts us, for instance, that something is wrong. So if you break your ankle, it hurts. Your body's telling you there's a problem here. Attend to it. Now, of course, the pain also modifies your behavior so that you don't aggravate or worsen the injury. So if you break your ankle again, it hurts, alerts you to it, you start attending to it. And then when you try to walk on it, it hurts more. So you can't just continue walking on it. That, of course, would aggravate the injury. And so pain's very useful to us. The painfulness of it is very useful to us. It motivates us highly to avoid certain circumstances, to attend and pay attention to certain stimuli. Now, of course, it can be overridden, and the body's very smart. If a bear's coming, you may want to run on that broken ankle, and so we can override that pain. But in the normal circumstances, it's very useful in alerting us to things we need to avoid or attend to. Now, notice, though, that the reason that we want to avoid the pain, the reason why we seek to avoid pain, is because that's good for us. It preserves our life ultimately in the long run. That's what's going on. So the normal purpose of self-love is life preservation. But here, in the suicide case, the thing which normally preserves our life is being used to end our life. And that's a contradiction in the purpose of the thing in question. So this is very interesting because this represents what's perhaps Aristotelian or natural law theory-like thinking in Kant's view. So the Aristotelians, remember, Aristotle argued that everything has a purpose. Its function, its entelechy, even human beings. And he gave his whole argument about that in terms of functions. And in the Middle Ages, this idea becomes very popular. And people think, well, all the stuff around us has functions. And it's wrong to use something in a way contrary to its function, because it was made for a certain purpose. And so to use it in another way is wrong. So if the purpose of pain is to preserve our life, it's wrong to use it to end our life. So here then there's a way of thinking, well, Kant is connecting up, drawing out a theme from earlier views and showing how the categorical imperative really embodies what is right about it. Now, another way of well, let me just hold off on a second on that. So here what he thinks he's demonstrated is that it's always wrong to commit suicide. It's never morally permissible to commit suicide. And you can use this exact same kind of argument to condemn any kind of sexual activity that is not explicitly for procreation. And Kant does very explicitly condemn masturbation and sex for pleasure. And in the modern times, people like the Pope have even condemned the use of condoms, even if the consequences are detrimental. Like, for instance, in Africa, the result has been the spread of HIV. The Pope says it's still wrong to use a condom because the purpose of sex is procreation. The purpose of sex is not pleasure. It's made for a purpose, namely procreation, bringing other life into the world. So these people like Kant and the natural law theorists think it's wrong to contradict that purpose. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is a different kind of contradiction than either of the other two kinds that we've met so far. So the bit about lying and stealing and murdering and so on is a formal technical contradiction, namely of this kind: the very thing that you're trying to do can't be done. The second kind of contradiction that we encountered was not that the very thing that you're trying to do can't be done, but rather it can be done, but it contradicts a basic human desire, a basic thing that if you reflect on the human condition, you see, aha, this contradicts that. That's a contradiction in will, as Kant put it, as the helping other people. Okay, so I'll leave that for future discussion on the discussion board, perhaps, if you're interested. For now, what we need to do is turn to the second formulation of the categorical imperative. So far we've only been talking, believe it or not, about one of these versions of the categorical imperative that Kant gives. He actually gives 4 of them. But before you freak out, we're only going to talk about these 2. Now, the first one he called the formulation of the laws of nature. And you could see that why he would call it that, because that formulation has us thinking about moral rules in respect of there being universal moral laws. Now, this is a different way of thinking about the categorical imperative. But according to Kant, it's a different way of thinking about the same thing. So this is not really a second rule of morality. It's the same rule. It's just looked at from a different perspective. And that, of course, has always puzzled people. But that's what he says. Okay, so we looked at the formula of laws of nature. Now we're going to turn to the second one, which is the formula of the ends in itself. Here's what it says. So act as to treat humanity, whether in yourself or in others, as an end in itself, and never as a means only. Well, what is this supposed to mean? Well, what it means is, first of all, it gives us the same result in every case. But second of all, and more importantly, what this thing is trying to get at is that human beings have a value which can't be reduced to what they're good for. So in the world around us, there are things which, well, first of all, let me back up. As I said previously, rational agents set goals for themselves that they deem as good. So for instance, you are working towards a college degree. You think it's a good thing to have a college degree, no doubt. Otherwise, you wouldn't be working towards it. So you have this thing that you recognize as a good, and you're working towards it. Now, there are things that you need to do in order to accomplish those goals, right? Those things that you need to do entail using the world around you in various ways. So if I need to go to work, I use my car as a means to get there. It's merely a tool to be manipulated by my rational nature. I see it as something which merely exists to serve my purposes. It's an object to be manipulated as I pursue the things that I deem good. Now, this second version of the categorical imperative is supposed to get at this basic idea. It is wrong to think of human beings in the same way that I think about my car. It is wrong to think of a rational agent as a tool that can be manipulated as a way to simply accomplish the goals that I set for myself. Now, why is this the case? Well, here's the basic argument that Kant gives. So take that story that I was just telling about how rational agents set goals for themselves, and they see these goals as goods. Now, this all has to do with this hypothetical imperative stuff that we talked about earlier. So you set yourself something as an end. You want to graduate from college, and then you have a bunch of hypothetical imperatives which then start mattering to you. If you want to graduate from college, then you need to take certain courses. If you want to graduate from college, then you need to pass those courses. If you want to graduate from college, then you need to attend those courses, etc., etc., etc. So now you have a reason to attend classes, to read books, to study, to show up on time, all because you're aiming towards this goal, which you recognize as good. But of course, you're surrounded by other agents whom you recognize as rational. And you just got through telling a story about how rational agents set goals for themselves that they recognize as good. So from the point of the universe, if one were to reason impartially about this, you have to recognize that the other person's goals are just important to them, are just as important to them as your goals are to you. And so just as you recognize that it's good for you to pursue these goals, you have to also recognize that it's good for them to pursue their goals. So you can't co-opt them in the service of pursuing your goals because they're pursuing their own goals. Now, interestingly, Kant thinks, well, for instance, in the case of animals, this isn't true. So it's always wrong to enslave a rational creature. A man should never be a slave. A woman either, for that matter. But a donkey is fine. If you take a donkey and harness it up to a cart and have that donkey pull the cart all day, you are not disrupting the goals of the donkey in any serious way. Now, what would the donkey be doing otherwise? Running around in a field somewhere, chewing on some grass perhaps, but it's not as though the donkey is sitting there thinking to itself, if only I weren't pulling this cart, I would be able to finish my degree at LaGuardia College. If only I weren't pulling this cart, I could get a job and make some real money. If only I weren't pulling this cart, I could blah, 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 blah. But of course, with a human being, with rationality comes the ability to plan, to set goals for oneself, to see them as good, and to pursue them. Whereas donkeys can't do that. So it's immoral to treat a human being as a means to your end, but Kant thinks perfectly moral to treat a donkey as a means to your end, or to treat a car as a means to your end. The car has no plans, no goals, sees nothing as good. Neither does the donkey, since all of that requires rational activity, recognizing the commonalities amongst things and that they belong to a class of that which is good. Okay, so that's the basic argument for why you can't treat other people as a means, because you don't, to put it bluntly, you don't want yourself to be treated as a means. In fact, the very concept of yourself as a rational agent entails that you can't be treated as a means. You demand that other people respect you as an end, as something which is valuable in its own right. And so since you demand that respect, and you recognize that the reason that you're owed that respect is in virtue of your rational nature and your ability to set goals for yourself, then you must respect that and recognize it in other creatures that you see around you that exhibit those properties. So you are forbidden to treat them as a way to simply accomplish your goals, just like they are forbidden to treat you that way. And it's because of your rational nature. So rationality is, at once, the foundation for morality, and the very thing which gives us value. It's what makes us moral agents in the first place. And as we'll see later, this is something the utilitarians object to, because it basically means that insofar as a thing isn't rational, that is insofar as it doesn't matter morally. And that's certainly what Kant thinks. If you are not rational, then you simply don't matter morally. There's nothing that you can do to a car which is immoral. Now, of course, you could be immoral to the owner of the car, but not to the car itself. And insofar as donkeys are like cars, you can't be immoral to them either, Kant thinks. We'll come back to that. Okay, so let's look at the 4 examples that we talked about, the perfect and imperfect duties, and notice also that there are some duties to oneself and duties to others here. So what's wrong with the lying promise? Well, here Kant says you're treating the other person as a means only, not as an end. You recognize that they won't give you the money unless you fulfill a certain requirement. So you just reason, how can I get this person to do what I want them to do? You, in effect, treat them as though they were an ATM. What's the code I need to punch in order to get the action that I want out? Money. Well, punch in code I promise to pay back, even though you don't intend to. Clearly, you're not respecting this person's goals and what they're trying to accomplish. You're trying to manipulate them, to reduce them to something which is no better than a donkey or an ATM. Now, the same, of course, is true of stealing. You recognize that the person doesn't want to give you this thing, wouldn't give it up voluntarily, otherwise you would ask for them. So you think of a way to circumvent their goals, their desires. And the way you do that is by simply taking it, using them as a means to accomplish your goals, reducing them simply to a storehouse of goods for you. So now suicide, Kant says, well, you're using yourself as a means to pleasure. And that's always been a bit controversial, but you can see what he means if you think about it. You're in this terrible agony, and the way you want to get out of this agony is by killing yourself, and relief from agony is a kind of pleasure. So you're not respecting yourself as something valuable, but you're simply thinking of your life and its end as a way to achieve a kind of pleasure, namely absence of suffering. Now, Now, at the end here, so that sums up basically the Kantian view in its very broad outline. Now, of course, there are all these kinds of traditional problems. And I just want to, at the end here, before we start talking about utilitarianism, point out some of the more traditional problems. In fact, this leads us right into our discussion of utilitarianism. So I mentioned this already, but anything that's not rational has no moral value and it can be treated as a means only. So this is always the first thing that people think of here usually is animals. What about animals? Well, Kant says that's right. We owe them nothing. They are not moral agents. They don't matter. Even though they feel pain, there's no way that you can act immorally to a dog, Kant thinks, because dogs aren't rational. They don't have rights, Kant says, because to have a right is to be a member of the moral community. To be a member of the moral community is to be a rational agent. So animals don't have rights. Neither do cars, neither do houses or trees. Trees are alive, they don't have rights. Animals are alive, they don't have rights. Animals feel pain, but that doesn't matter morally, Kant thinks. What matters is rationality. So now you'd say, well, gee, that's weird. So if I kick a dog and cause it pain, I'm not doing anything wrong to the dog? Kant says, no, you're not morally harming the dog, but you might be morally harming the person whose dog it is. So if I love that dog, and when you kick it and it cries, that causes distress in me, then you've harmed me. And that's bad, because you ought not to harm me. You have a duty not to cause unnecessary suffering in me. But of course, you don't have any duties to the dog. You're not violating your duty to cause unnecessary suffering when you kick the dog, Kant thinks. And people have always found that to be very counterintuitive. It seems very strange, to say the least. But even worse, you might think, is, well, gee, what about babies and the elderly, the senile, the mentally incompetent, the schizophrenic, etc.? They're not rational, so what do you say then? Well, it seems like you have to say the very same thing that you say about animals. And that's always bothered people. Well, you mean it's not morally wrong to kick a baby? You don't have a duty not to harm the baby. Well, you might have a duty not to cause harm to the parents, but you don't have any duties to the baby, people say. Now, there are various moves that people make here. For instance, they argue, some people have said, well, since babies will be rational someday, you should treat them as though they are now. So you're sort of like a check, on condition that later you be rational, I treat you a certain way. But of course, what if they grow up to be mentally incompetent or to have brain damage? Then you don't owe them anything. Again, it just seems wrong in its general structure, not in the details of it. It just seems wrong to think that rationality is all that matters. It seems to a lot of people that pain matters, and that if you cause pain in something, it doesn't matter whether that thing thinks or not. If it can feel pain, then it's bad to cause pain, because pain is itself bad. And Kant just doesn't think that. But that's what the utilitarians think, and that's who we're going to turn to next.